Hello, this is Steve Bhaerman, and welcome to Heartland Security. Here we go. Thank you so much for being here. This is our program. It's called Heartland Security, Discovering and Cultivating Our Sane and Sacred Center. You know, former President Dwight Eisenhower once said that someday the people of the world will want peace so much that the governments of the world will have to give it to them. Well, my sense is we're really on the threshold of that moment, because through the power of technology, we have the ability to gather thousands, hundreds of thousands, even millions of people in one place at one time. We can connect the global village in a matter of seconds. What's needed now, though, is the spiritual coherence to actually connect us at the heart and to bring forth what I would think is the true heart and soul of who we are as a humanity, as a species, what my cosmic comic cohort, Swami Bhayandananda, calls humanifest destiny, where we manifest our destiny as a species and become humankind. And human kindness, I think, will become the currency of this new species called humankind. Now, our guests this evening are two clergy people with a deep and broad vision, and who will be exploring how we actually do empower this heartful and soulful true self. First, we have Reverend Kathleen McTigue, who is the director of the Unitarian Universalist College of Social Justice. She has served for 25 years as a UU parish minister, including 21 years as senior minister to the Unitarian Society of New Haven, Connecticut. Now, a core part of her ministries has been public advocacy and faith-based organizing for marriage equality, immigrant rights, economic justice, and peace. Our other guest is the Reverend Lupton P. Abschirre. He's an Episcopal priest with over 25 years of experience serving faith communities around the country and in East Africa. His degrees are in organizational development, in theology, philosophy, and consciousness studies. He's also been a practitioner of meditation and other mindfulness disciplines since his college years. Now, Lupton's political interests are rooted in growing up in Washington, D.C., and in the work of his father, David Manker Abschirre, who served as a special counselor to President Reagan and was United States permanent representative to NATO and presided over the Center for the Study of the Presidency and Congress. I also want to thank my colleague, Barbara Fields, and the Association for Global New Thought for sharing my vision and helping it make this broadcast real through Zoom. And so to set the stage and animate the field, I'm going to channel my cosmic comic alter ego, Swami Bhayandananda, to offer an invocation, and maybe he'll offer an outvocation at the end. We'll see. Okay. Next voice you hear will be the Swamis. May we use this series to gather all good intentions under one big intent. Thrival for each and all, and may we activate Bucky Fuller's world game in contrast to the end of the world game. Some of our leaders seem dead set agone. Bucky's world game is to make the world work for 100% of humanity in the shortest possible time through spontaneous cooperation without ecological offense or disadvantage of anyone. Well, we are the leaders we have been waiting for. The Bucky starts here. And so here we are. We're starting. I want to begin this broadcast with an anecdote, something I heard about 20 years ago that I've always remembered. Patricia's son, who's a spiritual psychologist, friend of mine, told this story. And she was going to be doing a presentation at a quote-unquote New Age bookstore. And what she noticed as she arrived was that there were 4 fundamentalist Christians picketing outside the bookstore, picketing her presentation. And so she approached the bookstore owner and she said, I'm going to go talk to those people. And the owner said, nah, you can't talk to those people. You know, they're not going to listen to you. But Patricia said, I'm going to talk to them. And she walked out there and spent about 15 minutes in conversation with these people. And after 15 minutes, 3 of them put down their picket signs, hugged her, and said, that's what Jesus would say. And the 4th one continued to picket. So when I heard that story, it activated something in me that I've come to call the law of 75. That I perceive that 75% of people, even if they hold their beliefs really deeply and really strongly, are susceptible to the power of love and respect. They're susceptible to being approached in a kind and loving way. They're susceptible to being respected and listened to in their beliefs. And in those situations, the coherent center of the heart can overcome the separation of the beliefs in our minds. So what I love about the story is that this is an indicator that heartful communication may be the key to actually establishing the kind of human connections that we need to get us through this challenging evolutionary passage. So my sense is that this is this uncharted territory until now, and this is our new playground, and I'm hoping that this series, with all the people that we speak with and all of the contributors, including the people who are tuning in and will be asking questions and making comments later, will help us explore ways that we can enhance our community together, that we can cooperate more, and that we can communicate more effectively in discovering what it is that we share beyond those things that divide us. Now, my colleague Bruce Lupton, author of Biology of Belief and Spontaneous Evolution, says that the next phase of human evolution is recognizing we're all part of one superorganism called humanity. And the way of being we have collectively dismissed as utopian, our body would simply call health. Because after all, we have a community of 50 trillion cells underneath our skin, and they all cooperate. They all are working together. And when that's happening, that all of us are experiencing right now, if we're happy and healthy, is this sense of coherence that really is a sense of health. So the good news is that science is now confirming what our spiritual teachers have been telling us since the beginning, that we are all connected. And as Jesus said, what you do to the least of us, you do to me. So this is the field that I'm hoping that we'll be able to cultivate during this series. And I would add, that what we do to others, as we'll find out, we're essentially doing to ourselves and to our individual selves and to our collective. So I want to welcome all of you viewers. I want to welcome our guests. And I see that we now have Kathleen, McTigue, and Lupton, who are, thank you for showing up. And we already introduced you. So I'm going to start with the question. I'm going to ask Reverend Kathleen first, and then Lupton will chime in. How do we access a kind of a commonly sensed sense of the sacred? I know it's a big question. How do we access it?
To begin with, I think there are some common strands that kind of exist all around the globe for how people access the sacred. Some have to do with place, that is anything from a sacred grove to a mosque. Some avenues have to do with rituals. Rituals can be ones that we create or ones that go back thousands of years. And then some have to do with practices like prayer or meditation that we engage in that help us pay attention in the way that we want to. I would caution, though, that anytime we're talking about something that is universal, it's important to recognize who we are as we speak. So I recognize that I am a white woman who comes from a very privileged background, living in a very privileged country. So for me to assume that something I experience or an avenue through which I experience it can be universal is pretty presumptuous. And I think it's important for us to always be aware that we speak from a particular perspective, and we can only find out how universal something is by testing it with people who come from very different places and access the sacred through very different ways.
How about you?
I would start by recognizing that we're in a very unique age and culture, which is the modern culture. And I think the hallmark, for better or for worse, of our Western modern consciousness is being cut off from the sacred, being cut off from transcendence. So that brings certain advantages in terms of individual freedom, but I think largely it's detrimental. I see this period as kind of an adolescent stage that we've got to grow out of, and we've got to grow out of it fast. But how do you do that in a secular age? And I agree with Kathleen. I think both she and I are speaking as, Westerners, Americans, white privilege, all of that. So just speaking from my own work and my own experience, I would say the way back into the sacred is through vocational discovery and leadership development. And I'm using those terms, Steve, as you know, almost in a technical sense, particularly leadership development. I have been very much over the past, 4 or so years informed and a student of Theory U. Theory U comes out of the Sloan School of Management at MIT. It's a series of books written by Otto Scharmer. And this is used for innovative companies, but it is at its heart very spiritual. And he gives a very interesting etymological account of the term leadership. And the original sort of Indo-European term basically means death, to die. And so that's what makes it spiritual. And I think for modern people who are to a large degree hapless because we don't have the gods to tell us what to do any longer, this is the key. We can access the sacred through discovering our sacred task on earth, which could take a million different forms depending on us. But the way is you got to let go, as they say, let go and let God. And there's an elaborate process. But I just want to, as I was looking at my book, Theory U, Leading from the Future as it Emerges, I happened upon a quote by Goethe, the German poet that Otto uses. And I just want to quickly read this quote. It's pretty heavy, and I bet Kathleen's familiar with it. As so long as you haven't experienced this, to die and so to grow, you are only a troubled guest on the dark earth. And I think that's the challenge for modern Western people. So that would be my response to that question.
I want to follow up with Kathleen, because you're a UU minister and so on. There's a huge consciousness in the Unitarian Universalist Church in regards to all different kinds of people having different forms of expression and different backgrounds and so on. And you talked about your own privileged background, and everybody here obviously has that privilege. How have you found in your own congregations, how have you dealt with this kind of diversity and created a sense of connection and respect?
Well, it hasn't been all up to me, of course. I mean, as parish minister, you're a player, certainly, but one among many players. And in my years of experience, I would say that I have met just as many open-minded and tolerant Catholics and Episcopalians and Muslims and atheists as I have Unitarian Universalists. So I don't want to mischaracterize us as being, more broad-minded necessarily than others, although we certainly can be as smug and arrogant as any other part of the human family can be, and thinking about ourselves and thinking ourselves to be that way. I think what is different is that Unitarian Universalism is more explicit about welcoming diversity of opinions and perspectives on the spiritual, particularly in light of the knowledge of how many different ways there have been over many, many centuries that human beings have tried to reach for something sacred and then articulate it. So I think perhaps more explicitly than in some other faiths, we see there being many paths to the sacred, and that our best service to each other is to create communities of exploration where people feel as free as possible to dig deeply into the method that might work for them. I'm married to somebody who would jump out of his skin if he felt like he had to sit meditation for 20 minutes. He's a kinetic person. For me, sitting meditation is my avenue in, right? So to recognize there's not any one specific direction, I think is really important. And in terms of cultivating it, honestly, it's like any other virtue. People need to be reminded. So finding ways when people are behaving in ways that express intolerance or are limiting the possibility of conversation, even by those very common nonverbal signals, when we kind of roll our eyes or cross our arms or in other ways say, you're wrong, even if we're not overtly saying that. We need to be reminded to live up to the aspirations that we declare. In the case of Unitarian Universalism, the aspiration is to create an immensely large tent where people feel free not only to explore the avenues toward the sacred, toward God, toward the spiritual, but are listened into the capacity to articulate that, because it's such a tender space that we walk into when we try to share with another person what we mean by God, what we mean by spirit, by prayer, by sacred, by all of these words. And if we don't give each other compassionate listening, there's no way to find the words for what we're trying to say.
You know, I'm actually working with some people who have put together a conservative progressive dictionary so that people actually have the same language. And they know that they're saying that they mean the same thing by what they're saying. So I think that that's really a good point, that you can actually think you're communicating with someone, and what you're saying means something entirely different to their hearing. So I think that's important. I want to switch gears a little bit and talk about something totally different, and that is the idea of evil. Now, you know, again, that's kind of a hot, a third rail kind of thing, but people that I respect, Michael Dowd and Connie Barlow. Michael Dowd wrote a wonderful book called "Thank God for Evolution." He's a minister himself, and his wife is an atheist scientist. So they wrote this book, "Thank God for Evolution." And their definition of evil is, quote, self-interest that pursues its own financial or pleasurable self-interest, knowing that in doing so, it is harming the future or harming others or harming the body of life. So again, that's a very, in a certain regard, very secular definition of evil. So I'm very curious as to, again, first you, Kathleen, and then Lupton, is there such a concept of evil? Do you have a concept of that? Is there something that might be universal like that? Did you would say, yeah, that's something that we want to avoid?
Well, I could say many things that I would like to see us avoid, but when it comes to something as huge as evil, and trying to think about it, get our minds around it, and then articulate it, I think we're really in the same camp as when we try for any of those other huge concepts like God. We can work at it and try our best to get to what we mean by the word. But I mean, if you just consider all the permutations of it, in order to say, is there something called evil, you need to have some kind of common understanding of what do you mean, what do I mean by evil. And so, you know, you could use something like the definition that you used. You can use a slightly broader one that would basically say that which impedes life or that which causes deliberate harm. Those are ways to think about it. But it still gets very complicated. Is it possible to have a thought that is an evil thought? Is it possible to say something that simply by virtue of being spoken is evil? Or do we only mean that something is evil when we're thinking about actual events or actions in the world? And even there, you get complicated. Are you considering something evil based on the intent? But what if the intent was good and the impact caused deep harm? Then is it evil even though it wasn't? So you see, it gets very complicated. And what I end up thinking to myself is that I'm not sure the concept of evil is helpful. And there are two reasons for that, for me. One is that historically, in many different religions, the word has been used to connote a force outside of humanity, whether that force is the devil, Satan, something more abstract, but it is something outside of us. And it can therefore be used to say, I don't know, a hurricane, something that's a natural force of the earth is evil, right? So that's one reason why I don't think it's helpful. The other reason is that I think almost without exception, using that term distances us from the person or the action that we're denoting as evil. So it makes it very possible for us to think of ourselves in a camp that's us. We're the good people. And those people who did that, or who think that, or who believe that, or who say that, or who are in that party, or whatever the thing might be, those are evil people, or they're causing evil. So that's an immediate and drastic separation of the self from a behavior which, if you really think about it logically, is on the spectrum of the possible for every human being, or it couldn't be done by a human being, right? So what I would come down to is that I can think of behaviors that I would probably be tempted to call evil, like deliberately torturing another human being. It's hard for me to think of what to call that if it's not evil. But I try to resist that, because by using that term, I have completely separated myself from the person who has tortured, which means that person is not salvageable. It means I've declared that person to be in a category so separate from me that I can't imagine his or her salvation. And so I resist the term.
That's very clarifying. Thank you. Lupton.
Good. Well, that's a good setup, because when I read the questions in advance, and this is a very helpful definition that comes courtesy of the University of Chicago Hungarian psychologist. Very few of us know how to pronounce his name correctly, I think, but we all know about his psychology of flow. Mihai Csikszentmihalyi. And he co-authored a book before he became well known in the early 80s called The Meaning of Things, Domestic Symbols, and the Self. And it's a pretty academic book, but he gives a very interesting, I think very helpful etymology of the word underlying symbol, which we're all familiar. And if you'll bear with me, I'm just going to read this one paragraph. He says, in ancient Greece, symbalein meant to throw together or to join. The phrase came to designate a coin that two friends break in half, each with the hope of reuniting. When the two friends would meet again, the joining of the two half coins signified the relationship between the two persons. So the separation of the coins served the larger purpose of unity. Thus, symbol originally meant that which brings people together. Now, here's the response to your question. It is significant that the opposite of symbalein is diabalein, to throw apart or to separate, which is the root of our word for diabolic, which is the essence of evil. Evil is what separates the self of a person into conflicting forces, which divides one person from others, which sets up people against the cosmos. So it's interesting, Kathleen's answer. She's saying, well, you got to be careful, because even your use of the word evil can be diabolical by separating people. And just to make this connect with current events, I just wanted to read this quote. So we are all familiar with the latest on Facebook and Cambridge Analytica and all of that. So what you may have heard this. One of the executives with Cambridge Analytica was taped, when they were taping Channel 4. And he said, our job is to drop the bucket further down the well than anyone else, to understand what are those really deep-seated underlying fears. And then he says, it's no good fighting an election campaign on facts because actually it's all about emotion, which of course Edward Bernays taught us 100 years ago. But it's all about fear and manipulating people's fear to do the diabolic. And so I would say what we're seeing with this Cambridge Analytic is a little taste of the diabolical, because that's exactly what it's engineered to do, is to separate, to throw people apart.
Very interesting. Obviously, the term, obviously demonizing somebody is diabolical. So if you actually demonize someone, as Kathleen pointed out, this is really very interesting how this is all kind of molding together, that's where you have to be very careful. It's like, well, I can tolerate anything but intolerance. Those intolerant people, when I do my Swami routine, and used to be that people said, you can't be judgmental. So Swami would say, I think people who are judgmental are terrible, and then all of a sudden you're in this paradox where you're doing the exact thing that you're suggesting other people don't do. Kathleen, anything on that?
No, I mean, I think I think it's a very interesting segue from what I was saying into the quotes that were offered, and I think we're coming at the same point where the care that one takes is because of recognizing that there are these threads that run through all of us, right? And I think it was Solzhenitsyn who said that the line between good and evil runs through every human heart.
Yes.
You can't separate it out. So, yeah.
There was a wonderful book written by a Jungian psychologist called Unholy Passions. And it was about the vampire archetype. And she said that in every society, there is some kind of representation of the vampire. And she said that each of us has this as what she called a low-level infection. We each have a low-level infection with this vampire virus. And it's situations that activate it. There was I can't remember the guy's name. He was in Poland. He wrote a book on I think he called it ponerology, which was about the understanding what he called evil. And during the Soviet during the time when Poland was part of the Soviet bloc, he said that 25% of the people who were in the Polish secret police ended up in mental institutions. And what he was saying was that because they were forced to be in kind of a sociopathic atmosphere, it was so contrary to their nature that it drove them crazy. And that's a high figure, 25%. So when, I'm sure that not everybody who worked for Enron was a sociopath, but it was their sociopathic environment where, in order to actually be part of that, you had to do things that would violate the ordinary person's conscience. Okay, good. So here we are. We're again going to go to some other questions. Again, taking an opposite, moving again to the other side of things. There's been the golden rule, and for years and years, I've seen this entire list of different representations of the golden rule as it was expressed by this religion or that religion or this spiritual path or that spiritual path. So where does the golden rule fit in? Is it so abstract that we can't follow it? Does the golden rule mean, well, it's just for our people to treat ourselves with those people over there, we can treat them any way we like? What about that golden rule? We'll start with you, Kathleen.
Well, I have people say that the golden rule, as we often hear it, which is do unto others as you would have them do unto you, doesn't work so well in the sense that we are making assumptions again about how people would like to be done unto. And while it sounds very simple, it isn't necessarily, as one can find out easily if you travel into a different culture from your own. Even here within the United States, people behave differently according to their comfort levels and so forth. But having said that, I do think that there are threads of what could be called the golden rule in every moral teaching I've ever come across, that there really is a limited menu of what we as human beings understand to be virtuous living, not virtual, virtuous living, what it means to treat one another with kindness. I think kindness is a recognized virtue or element in every human interaction. People see it in each other's eyes. They see it in the gestures that we use with each other, and they certainly experience it. So I think that the fundamental ways that we present ourselves to one another that echo the threads of kindness, of compassion, and of respect are desperately needed in every human interaction, from the most modest to the most, important. And that it's easy to see in the political culture, and I know that we'll be segueing into that as well, but for me it feels desperately important that we elevate some of those deep values of how we would interact and counter the messages that we are hearing from the highest levels of political office, but really permeating our political system. One of the most drastic ways that it struck me was in January when President Trump was discussing immigration and the need to restrict immigration. And he used a cruder term than latrine countries or outhouse countries.
Yeah. Right.
But, words are incredibly important and very powerful because words shape our thoughts and our thoughts shape our actions. As human beings, we make sense of the world by the stories we tell and by the images and the emotions that those stories evoke. So when an entire nation is declared to be a latrine or an outhouse or a toilet, the image that evokes for the people who call that place home means that those people are completely disposable. They can be flushed. Mm-hmm. They can be forgotten.
Yeah.
So I think that we're living in a time right now where the urgency of elevating a different word, a different way of being, a different way of understanding other human beings is more urgently needed, certainly than any time in my lifetime.
That's certainly true. That's certainly true. It's certainly up in our face that all of the things that, we've had kind of a kind face on things for 8 years under Obama, and all of this has been under the surface, and now it's coming out to be like a boil, like a toxin from the body. It's coming out to be healed. Let's hope. Lupton, what do you say about the golden rule?
Well, I would agree with Kathleen on we have to be careful on presuming or assuming how I would like to be treated. I mean, we'll just pick on Trump for another minute. How would Trump like to be treated? Well, we know he's a radical narcissist, right? So he would want to be treated like the whole world revolves around him. The other part of your question that you sent us in advance had to do with happiness. How about the phrase, may all beings be happy? Again, the question is, well, what is happiness, right? So we have to be mindful of our assumptions. But I think for us, it begins with paying attention to the other person, sort of beholding the other person. It might be a rule of thumb that everybody is right to some degree. It may be just a crumb of rightness or truth, but experientially, even somebody like Donald Trump, and it may be in a way that they are not even aware. But if it is all one universe, which is the term universe, if it's all, however you want to put it, God's creation, then it's all part of it if we're not going to bifurcate. So somehow we pay attention to other people, we'll see, that there is some truth. I mean, this is what respect is about, looking again, rather than just reacting to people. So I think that's where maybe the golden rule fits in. And then I think the other big thing that makes our time evolutionary is more and more people are becoming aware of the importance of the practices of self-awareness, right? Because if you are not aware of yourself, you can't take responsibility for yourself, and we're responsible for our inner state too. So it's sort of a dual process of awareness, paying attention to the other person as you engage them, ideally face to face and relationally, and at the same time being self-aware of your inner state and where you're coming from.
So I think it's certainly true that ways of communicating among others that rehumanize rather than dehumanize. I've been part of something called living room conversations, which where people gather together from different political tribes. Usually you invite your friends that you know who are conservative or progressive, and you get together. And one of the things that that really works with this is before any kind of discussion takes place, everybody gets a chance to tell their story, in the sense that there is that aspect of, you know, why you're here, what brought you here, what your concerns are, what your biggest hopes and fears, and so on. And this has been shown to be a really amazing way for people to cultivate empathy and compassion. There's a story of in Ireland when the Catholic and Protestant troubles were at their peak. They brought together a group of women who were widowed in this thing, and half of them were Catholic and half were Protestant. But being brought together in this group, nobody knew who was who. And so they had to listen to their personal stories without knowing which side they were on. And at the end, it became really a love fest for these women who had all been through the same thing. And they began to recognize that having been through that, they had a lot more in common than the sides that they had originally been on. I think maybe it was because they were women, they were much more in touch with that. But the point is that when you actually create a way of having people listen to one another, it makes it much, much, much harder to dehumanize them and put them in those kinds of places.
If I can add one thought onto that, Brian Stevenson, who's a lawyer who works deeply and really considers it his life's mission to work with men who are living on death row, talks a lot about what he calls the power of proximity. And I think that's what you're talking about too. What he basically says is that when we come proximate to a problem or to a person, as opposed to running away from it or distancing ourselves, it changes us. And it has something to do with the intimacy that arises from proximity, that you can't so easily dismiss or dehumanize somebody when you're really looking into their eyes and hearing their story. So I appreciate you sharing the story from Ireland.
Yeah, and I think that that's really it. And of course, we're in our silos. We're in our very, you know, we're very aware of how isolated we all are. I mean, we're hearing things from the people that we know, the people who largely agree with us, and maybe people that don't agree with us, but we're all in the same culture and the same milieu. And when you go into an entirely different place where there's a different history, it becomes quite a challenge to make that bridge. And to my friends who have all been in the Peace Corps and that sort of thing, when you do make that connection, those are enduring connections, when you make a connection that goes beyond the cultural differences. So, you know, maybe we, as you know, somebody once asked the Swami, how do we create peace in the Middle East? And the Swami says, oh, first we need to have peace in the Middle West. And, you know, that's where we are, at least as, you know, in our middle class culture. How do we bring ourselves together to the table where we can have a civil conversation? Let's go up to the, what is the commonly shared human sensibility that would allow us to actually cultivate this spiritual maturity and bring it forward in other people? I mean, we've really all talked about how this illusion of separation is what keeps us, it's what allows us to dehumanize other people. What is the opposite? What is it? Is there some kind of universal coherence and call that that calls to our heart that we can all hear? What would allow us to cultivate that? Kathleen first, and then Lupton.
Don't you think it's Lupton's turn to go first?
Okay, well, okay, sure. Why not let Lupton?
Taking advantage of Kathleen's answers and just
I'm sorry, I need to make...
riding on her coattails. I'm riding behind you. Well, actually, the answer that I gave to the other question was the one I had written down for this one. But let me just give you a sort of Swami-like anecdote to respond to it. So when in the 1970s, I was a cab driver in the Washington, D.C. area. And I had a very wise and very courtly older cab driver who took me aside and gave me some advice. And I realized, looking back, really all I needed to be successful as a church pastor, I learned driving a cab from this advice. But he said, now, son, you're going to get all kinds of people in your cab from all races, creeds, and colors. But one thing they're all going to have in common is they're all going to want to talk. And so no matter who they are, no matter what they say, you, the cab driver, only say two things. One is, yeah, you're right. And the other is, I know what you mean. And I guarantee you'll get good tips. Well, of course, that was tongue in cheek. But the thing is, if you think about it, if we could engage people where, yeah, you are right in some respect. And then I know what you mean, which is basically walking the mile in another person's shoes, putting yourself in their position and there, but for the grace of God go I, that kind of empathetic engagement. So I think that, that really is the way forward for us to move to a new level of maturity, and I think for our time, we've got to take responsibility for our inner state, because in the past people have thought, well, I can't help my thoughts. I can't help my feelings, that kind of thing. But I think we also have to take more responsibility for our relationships and also not just one-on-one, but communal. So I'm sure Kathleen could, talk from her experience as a church pastor. But, the 25 years of my experience, so much of it is really building a capacity in a community so that they can take responsibility for their relationships and ultimately their relationship with God, because that's where they get their sense of purpose from. And so that's what I think we're being called to, and that's the opportunity. And for Americans, Steve, you and I have talked about this. I mean, Trump, there's a real silver lining to Trump because he's showing us we cannot take our democracy for granted. So he's sort of jarring us out of our complacency. And so that's the good, the sort of good news about Trump daily, with his agitprop and his stirring the pot, all of that.
Kathleen, anything to add to that?
Well, so one of the things that I would go back to, I guess, a little bit is your story about the woman in the bookstore with people picketing her. I think that the tendency toward that delightful feeling of self-righteous anger is a very common thing. We all know what that feels like, and it's very easy to feed it in ourselves, to just talk about what a jerk the other person is or what a horrible policy that is or whatever, and feel very virtuous in our opinion. And it seems to me that one virtue that perhaps is underrated that your author friend demonstrated was curiosity, just curiosity. Sometimes within my UU fold, when people have not been living up to the tolerance that we proclaim and that really is the legacy of our religious ancestors, I try to frame tolerance as this stance of you sort of stand there with your arms crossed and you go, all right, I tolerate you, right? That's tolerance. But what I'm more interested in and what I think we're called to is what I prefer to call glad curiosity. And I think glad curiosity is what bridges multitudes of gaps, that we come toward one another with a stance that says, tell me more. Mm-hmm. Not so I can tell you where you've gone wrong, right? But because I want to understand the world through your eyes. So I'm going to bring forward my glad curiosity. And I think, like any virtue, we can cultivate that in ourselves. That's a choice. We can decide to be self-righteous and angry, or we can say, I'm going to tip away from that. I'm going to deliberately tip away from that and step forward instead with something closer to glad curiosity.
I like that term, glad curiosity. I think curiosity is one of the most underrated tools in the toolkit. And it's not widely cultivated. And when we see it, we're always delighted by curiosity. I would say that my life has been, the good things in my life have happened because of curiosity, of talking to people I wouldn't have talked to otherwise, of initiating conversations I wouldn't have started. And thank God that I was able to develop that unhindered in my life, and not having the curiosity killed a cat. Well, I'm a dog, I don't care, so it's okay. Well, now I really appreciate this conversation and where it's going and where it's gone. We'd like to open it up to people who are on the call who have some questions. So I'm assuming that Barbara can do this for us because she's behind the scenes, like the real Wizard of Oz, who can do that. Are there people who do have questions, and can we connect them, Barbara?
Well, I wanted to remind everyone that there's a function on their dashboard that allows them to raise their hand if they would like to join the conversation. So is there anyone who would like to raise their hand and ask a question or make a comment to any of the panelists? Let me see here. Okay, I'm gonna bring Stephen Pope onto the screen.
Oh, hello. First, thank you for the ministry. I felt like this was a sermon rather than a discussion, and appreciated the interplay. But what I was hoping you could talk more about was the golden rule. It seems like that's such at the core of not just actual faith traditions, but just being a good person. So for me, I guess when you were talking about it and saying it makes assumptions about what we think the other person wants, or our attitude or our perspectives, is there something deeper, or is there a way we can discern this, or what would a more advanced version of the golden rule sound like to you?
I think it would be maybe a combination, for me, a combination of the traditional one, do unto others as you would have them do unto you, perhaps combined with the glad curiosity to first ask them. As opposed to, I was saying it quite broadly because I think that there are times when we assume a certain norm, I guess I would say, that is not necessarily the norm in terms of how people are interacting. So that's on a somewhat superficial level. And I guess on the deeper spiritual level, the things that I segued into, kindness and compassion and respect, are, I think, things that are hard to go wrong on. So for me, that's how I understand the golden rule being enacted, is by people trying in every way they know how to bring forward in their interactions kindness, compassion, and respect.
Okay.
Yeah, well, I guess I would add, just speaking from my experience, again, using curiosity and wonderment and stuff, I have a very metaphysical view of things. And so often when I'm engaging people, I'm aware that this is a fellow soul that is incarnated with their own trials and tribulations as well as their tasks. And even if their life looks, to my view, that it's a mess or going in the wrong directions, at some larger, deeper level, they're however you want to put it, they're doing the best they can. And then if you really want to take it to level 5, the role of that, if everyone has a guardian angel, and other divine beings that are participating. So again, this idea of respect, I agree, we want to take it out of the abstract, but it's to deepen our perspective of people as well as ourselves. So I think it goes back to paying attention to others, and that's what we all want.
When you said guardian angel, I'm sure that there's certain people we might imagine have a guardian devil working with them.
Yeah, well, I'll tell you, one resource that I found very valuable, and your viewers may or may not be familiar with the Irish mystic, Lorna Byrne, who is a contemporary. She's written a bunch of books, and don't judge by the covers. The covers look sort of, airy-fairy, but she's a clairvoyant, and since childhood, she's seen and engaged angels, and she's solid. I think she's the real deal. And it's very challenging, to think that you have and everybody else has a guardian angel. And, you can get into synchronicities and stuff. But that's another way to respect people. Even the criminal, has a guardian angel. And again, we church people use abstractions, as a child of God and blah, blah, blah. But the thing that appeals to me about Lorna Byrne is she's speaking from experience. And I think that's the other thing. We need to deepen our experience, right?
And all of that, that brings us to things like reincarnation, which apparently was part of the Christian belief system before Constantine codified it. And it's part of what many, many systems believe in, that, this is not just one journey, but we keep going around and around and around in a learning opportunity. And Ian Stevenson has done a lot of research with children who remember their past lives. He's actually taken them to places where they were able to point out this, that, or the other thing from a life that they lived recently. And I have no reason to believe it's true and no reason to believe it's not true. But there are all of these things out there that would indicate that the broadness of human experience in general, that we come back and we return in different roles and different places. That in a certain sense, we don't really have a coherent cosmology of this is how things are, other than recognizing perhaps the science cosmology, the universe story, the Big Bang, et cetera, et cetera. From that perspective, yeah.
We have another comment or question, and before we get too close to the end, I'd like to ask Lynn if she'd like, if I can put her on the screen and she can ask her question.
Sure.
Yes, hello, namaste. Thank
Hi
you
there.
for this beautiful platform and conversation and evolution. I have such a dream, and I'm wondering how to proceed or what you think, and to develop. I keep hearing a new age WPA for heart and soul-based community services with a basic guaranteed income, a good one. A good basic guaranteed income with single payer for all these new jobs, so we can stop the thought forms quickly that are going towards more war, more guns, more war, more guns, more drugs, and more drug wars, and So do you have any ideas on how to get that, happening and in the consciousness and move it through the internet? Because a lot of people are blocked, and I'm wondering about that because they've been so programmed into certain belief systems, like there's always been war, period. And then you have to tell them, yeah, but there's not always been internet.
Do you know that there was a campaign in Switzerland, of all places, to establish a guaranteed national income? And it got quite a bit of notice and so on. And it's even taken hold among conservative libertarians. The idea that when you're at the point where we do have the means of manufacturing, I don't think it's a terrible thing that we have machines doing jobs, if those are jobs that people could be liberated to doing other things. So I think that this guaranteed income idea gets us away from the quote unquote work ethic and moves us much more toward the self-realization ethic through service. So I just want to see if Lupton or Kathleen have any comments about that.
Well, I guess I'd say one thing is we need greater participation in our political process, because as I think we're becoming aware, it really is just a small portion of our population, and mostly a sort of, economically elite portion of the population that's hogging the political energy. And so that's, I think, again, with Trump stirring things up, many people are looking for new opportunities for civil and civic engagement. And the internet also can provide opportunities as well.
Anything to add, Kathleen?
Yeah, it's kind of a big radical statement, but I think the problem is capitalism. The problem is capitalism. I mean, we have been so completely infused for so long with the idea that the absolute only logical system for any economy is the capitalist system. And so we don't ever ask anymore, what's the economy for? And capitalism has only one answer, which is profits. That's what the economy is for. So as long as the economy is for profits, there will be a small elite that gets most of the profits and a whole lot of other people who suffer. If in fact the economy starts to be for human thriving and to spread that thriving as widely as possible, it probably won't be capitalism anymore.
Exactly. Yeah, it's interesting. There was an economist back in the 1930s named Carl Wilkin who said that there's three kinds of capitalism. There's state capitalism, which he meant, socialism at that point, National Socialism. There's corporate capitalism, which is what we have today primarily. And then there was this other thing that he called people's capitalism. Mm-hmm. And his idea of people's capitalism was simply the exchange of goods and services that take place between people, and have that be a fair exchange without the kinds of middle people or upper people that we've had. Now that we have a much more, let's say, horizontal economy as a potential. Now it used to be that if you had a music group, you want to get a record contract. Now they just gather their fans and do it themselves. They don't need the producer. They don't need the hierarchical top, and much more. That's happening much more. So I think that capitalism has been the elephant and the donkey in the living room, because both political parties bow down to that god. And I think that this is, as we lift the veils on these things, we're going, we may have to find a better system than that in order for us to really thrive as an organism, as a human organism together. Mm-hmm. Okay, we're getting very close to the end. I just want to see if there's any more additions or comments by our guests, other than I wish we had another hour or two, but anything that you want to add to wrap this up?
Well, Steve, I think you have your topic for another show, which is all around capitalism and economics, and new economics for the 21st century. So beyond the financialization of the economy and beyond consumerism. So it's consumerism for the masses and financialization for the elite. And they're both unsustainable in all kinds of ways. So I'd recommend that as a topic for one of your next shows, Steve.
Exactly. Thank you so much, Lupton. And thank you so much, Kathleen, for both of your participation and wisdom, particularly in coming to that. In some ways it's an obvious conclusion, but it's not that obvious, because like water for fish and air for birds, capitalism has been a system that we're all working within and somehow trying to be kind and manage and be just and so on. And it makes it more challenging to practice the golden rule when you're living with something that is made to extract in a rather sociopathic way.
Yeah.
Right.
So thank you both for being here with us. Thank you, everybody who's on the call. Thank you, Barbara Fields and AG&T for being our host. We'll be back next month with another program. Thank you.
Thank you.
You're welcome. Goodbye.